him to actually, out of this very tight schedule, we requested him to give a kind of presentation for our students, particularly for anthropology students and other interesting ones. So he kindly accepted our request. Thank you for that. And then welcome you all for managing your time, even in the public holiday. So about Christopher, I think at least some of you already had some classes with or some workshop with Christopher Martin Chutari. So Christopher is an anthropologist, an art historian, and a professor of anthropology and visual culture at University College London at the moment. But he has actually taught in several colleges, several universities, including Australian National Universities, University of Chicago, University of Cape Town, and of course Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. Why I'm saying of course is most of his works are in India. So he has a long kind of engagement in the history of photography and photography and anthropology in India. So I'm not going to tell you what kind of work that he did in or he has done in India. We hope that he would actually tell us or brief us some of his work in India, in addition to what he's going to present today. And he has authored and co-authored several books. Camera Indica, The Social Life of Indian Photographs, Photo of the Birds, and The Coming of Photography in India are some of his major works, and he has co-authored several others, with, preferably with Indian writers, Indian photo, I don't know, how do you call it, photo anthropologist or photo study people, I don't know. The one who actually...
Photo historian?
Photo historian, exactly. And he has another presentation at Martin Chutari on Sunday. So some of you who can actually manage time, please be there too. And he has also accepted, or at least we have agreed to discuss on a point that next year when he will be here in Nepal, then we will have a 2 days workshop on photography and anthropology or related subjects. So I think this much about his introduction, and he's very good at Hindi and Nepali already बुझ्नुहुन्छ. So and if I have left any major component of the introductory part, please you add on that too, and floor is yours. So our modality is like, for example, he will be presenting on 51 hours or so, and then we'll have a short round of question and answer round, like half an hour or so. And probably, hopefully, if the tea shop out there is open, then we can have a cup of tea together, and we can discuss there too. So thank you once again for coming here, and thank you, Christopher, for accepting.
Thank you very much, Suresh. Thank you all for coming on national holiday. I appreciate it. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about visual anthropology, or at least the way I do it. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to stress at the beginning was that I don't think there's an agreed monolith called visual anthropology. Visual anthropology turns out to be what a few people are doing, and they're all doing it rather differently. It makes me think of a famous quote from the art historian E.H. Gombrich, who said there's no such thing as art, there are only artists. And I think you could say the same about visual anthropology. There are only people who call themselves visual anthropologists, and what they do is all strikingly different. So many, possibly most visual anthropologists still think that it's a methodological sub-branch of anthropology in general that discusses how you use images by which they primarily mean moving film, to capture cultural and social behaviour. So a large part of visual anthropology is a rather inward-looking discussion about how anthropologists should use movie cameras. I'd say that version of visual anthropology doesn't really interest me at all. I've come to it through a different route, which is basically straight out of social anthropology. So my PhD from London School of Economics was on industrial workers in a very large Grasim semi-synthetic textile factory in Madhya Pradesh. So it was essentially industrial sociology stroke social anthropology. And while I was conducting this research, I fell in love with the images that villagers and town-based industrial workers had on their walls. So I found myself during this 15 months fieldwork becoming less interested in attendance rosters and what they could tell me about the commitment problem among Indian industrial workers. I found myself becoming more interested in calendar art, as it's sometimes called, and out of that grew a deep interest in photography. So it's been a rather idiosyncratic, unpredictable, accidental journey, and what I'm trying to suggest is that I think that's largely true for many people like me who think that what they're doing is some fusion of anthropology with visual culture, which they're happy to call visual anthropology. So there are these different idiosyncratic strands that lead all of us to where we are, and what I'm going to try and do today is give you a brief sense of where I am today, what interests me, and what some of the theoretical and conceptual antecedents of those interests are. So the kind of headline announcement is that there is no coherent body of knowledge called visual anthropology that I'm somehow going to give you the key to. What I hope I will do is enthuse you with the possibilities of using an anthropological analysis of visual culture to open up broader questions. And so the broader question I want to try and engage today is the question of contemporary South Asian politics, the future of democracy, the role of the image within that, and especially the functioning of Photoshop within that. So this is very much India-centric. There are a few broader South Asian echoes that we'll hear from time to time, but I also hope that you will have a clear sense that part of what motivates me in this kind of inquiry is also a sense that global media and politics are under assault by what is usually called fake news. I believe that was the Merriam-Webster dictionary new word of the year, fake news. There's a lot of it about. I mean, just this morning, Trump's press secretary, in response to criticism about his retweeting of what have now been shown to be fake videos, supposedly showing aggression by Muslims, have been shown to be not what they are claimed to be. And the riposte this morning from his press secretary was, it doesn't matter if the videos are fake. What matters is if we believe these things are true. So what we have now in the heart of the American administration is a kind of pure theory of the autonomy of the imagination, which is weirdly like a theory that conquered South India in the 16th century, which has been brilliantly written about by David Shulman. We'll encounter him a little bit later on. So this is a regional study, but it's one that I hope generates observations about the world as a whole. And I take that to be part of what anthropology and sociology should be trying to do. Focusing empirically on the small scale, on the actual, on the documented, on the observed, but then trying to generate insights that are translatable into unexpected, much broader global context. So I thought I'd start by a wonderful interview with the recently deceased Parsi photographer Hormai Veerawala, famed as the only female photographer in the Indian press corps for many decades, who famously photographed Gandhi multiple times, then became very closely associated with Nehru. I should say, just as a footnote, that I had the opportunity to invite her when she was 95 to come and visit Chicago, where I was teaching, and she flew out with Sabina Gadiho, completely intrepid. This was her first foreign trip. She'd never left India before, and yeah, she was a sensational, remarkable person filled with the most incredible stories, like about how Gandhi used to scream at her not to use a flashlight because it hurt his eyes. Wonderful stories about Ho Chi Minh. One could talk for an hour about Hormai Veerawala. But this interview from 1960 or so crystallises one of the things I want to start by getting us to think about. And what she's talking about, she's asked this question here, a rather silly question by a journalist: what was the most important picture that you missed? And inevitably she says that it was the day she was due to attend Birla House to photograph the Mahatma. She was leaving her office, something was drawn to her attention, she had to go back into the office, something else then came up, so she decided that she'd go to Birla House in the evening instead. And then half an hour later, she got the news that Gandhi had been assassinated by Nathuram Godse at the very spot where conventionally Hormai Veerawala used to stand and take his photograph. And so this news story is about her regret, her sense of loss at having missed this fantastic, the world's greatest news picture, as this ludicrous headline has it. And what interests me here is that this story dramatises the fact that for a certain kind of photography, to produce a photograph, you had to have the photographer, the apparatus and the subject all co-present at the same time. And what Hormai is drawing our attention to here is that 2/3 of that equation were missing, and therefore the photograph couldn't be made. And of course this raises the question of our situation now, in which photographs could still be made in the absence of any of those elements, courtesy of Photoshop. And what I'm interested in exploring is what are the political, social and cultural consequences of that. I'm also interested in asking how new this is. I mean, in what way should we frame this as a historical phenomenon? So Photoshop fakes, Photoshop scandals are everywhere. 2 Maharashtrian policemen were dismissed for supposedly or distributing photographic evidence of having ascended Mount Everest, subsequently shown to be untrue. Saidi Delwar Hussein's Razakar war criminal, Bangladeshi war criminal's face appeared on the moon during his trial, and many mosques throughout Bangladesh broadcast announcements urging their congregations to go out into the streets and behold this miraculous sign, this symptom of the wrongness of what was happening in these war trial crimes. This was very widely disseminated in Bangladeshi media. In Uttar Pradesh, currently, the completely eccentric theories of P.N. Oak, who used to publish badly printed little booklets claiming that the Taj Mahal was in fact a Shiv temple that had been radically re-engineered with the use of scaffolding, you can see top right, and had changed a Shiv temple into a corrupted Muslim building. So for decades, PNOK has been agitating on this subject, trying to get anyone he can to listen and to take up his cause in the hope that the Taj Mahal will be reconverted back into its original Shiv temple. He's languished in more or less complete eccentric silence until the last few years, when Photoshop images, one top right, purporting to show changes in what, 1640, between 1641 and 1668, as described by Tavernier, the early traveller. These can now be given a new substance photographically. We in the present can see photographic evidence of the reconstructive work that was done on this Shiv temple. And as we all know, the UP Tourism Board has now deleted the Taj Mahal from its list of attractions. Yogi Adityanath is increasingly voluble on the topic of, well, he's essentially internalized the PNOK thesis, appears to believe it, and there's the making of a potentially catastrophic conflict around this, this iconic artifact. So history is, we could say, history is changing, but also our notion of what counts as evidence for a historical account is changing. And this is where I found some observations by the French poet and critic Paul Valéry, very illuminating. He wrote a famous essay in 1939. So he's writing in Paris in 1939, a few months before Hitler and the Nazis invade Paris. So the moment of the writing of this document, which is in the centenary of photography's discovery in 1839, is very significant. We've had 100 years of photography, and the sense that Valéry communicates is that we're on the cusp of some troubling new potential dissolution. And what I'm trying to suggest is that Photoshop presents a similar kind of threat. You know, maybe they're not equivalent to Hitler and the Nazis, but the capacity to transform history into something different is very real and profound. And so one of the things that Valéry says, which has always stuck in my mind, is what he would say is that photography has created our modern sense of historical veracity, of historical plausibility. When we think about, is this historically plausible? Could it have happened? We actually resort to photographic metaphors, and we tend to think, could something have happened historically is the same as saying, could such and such a thing have been photographed? So as he says, it suggests this simple question, could such and such a fact, as it is narrated, have been photographed? And the obvious counterfactual to that is that if it couldn't have been photographed, then it's not eligible for historical candidacy. We would have to say it's myth, imagination, it's some other defective, inadequate, non-historical phenomenon. And he has quite a lot to say about this photographic metaphor. So he says that we tend to break things down into things witnessed, into moments that were caught in quick takes, another photographic filmic metaphor, or could have been caught had a cameraman, some star news photographer, been on hand. So there's also the idea that history is, there are lots of historical things we never get to see because the cameraman isn't quick enough. Coming back to Humayun Mohammed, she wasn't there, she got there too late. We could also relate this to a much longer debate within European historiography and the work of Anthony Pagden in The New World. Pagden uses this term autopticism, seeing with mine own eyes. It has a kind of vaguely Foucauldian ring to it. Those of you that have read The Birth of the Clinic may get an echo of the autoptic. But what Pagden is interested in is early debates in the Americas. Inevitably, they actually take place in Spain, but they're between Spanish proponents and opponents of the Spanish colonization of New Spain. And in this case, Bartholomew de las Casas, the famous sort of proto-humanist, and a guy called Oviedo, who's an unapologetic supporter of the colonization of the Caribbean and of South America. And they have this famous debate in which Pagden says a new mode of historical discourse emerges, because they both say things like, but I have seen this with my own eyes. The other one then says, no, but I saw it with my eyes. So it becomes a kind of battle of the eyes. What neither of these figures are saying are, but I read in an ancient text, or, you know, Seneca says such and such. There's a rejection of ancient textual authority and the new emergence of empirical experience and of visual experience as the most privileged way of being able to claim truth. So it's, for Pagden, this marks a moment where imagination recedes. It doesn't matter. In fact, it becomes a weakness if you imagine something. What matters is you have to see something, and to use a kind of ahistoricist leap, we could say you need to see something like a camera. So these debates are happening in the 16th and 17th century and go under the name of autopticism, the authority of the eye in establishing what is true. Okay, I wanted to very briefly bring in Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, and even more briefly Ariel Azoulay, so three very important photographic theorists, and what they have had to say about the event. So the sort of working title of this presentation is Event and Code. And here event stands in for that conventional understanding of what happens with photography and history. So we could say that the assassination of Gandhi was an event, and Homayi Veerawala's problem was that she missed it. She got there too late. The second part of the title is Code, and that's intended to refer to the flexibility, the free-floatingness of digital code, obviously, in the context of Photoshop. So event and code is something I want us to get us to think about. In the end of the talk, I'm going to try and collapse those differences a bit, because what I want to suggest is that there isn't really any such thing as the digital. The digital is a kind of a metaphor, a fantasy for talking about things that we think or hope can be immaterial. What I want to suggest is that the digital is, which claims to be or appears to be weightless, in fact is always weighed down by what we could call analog grit. There's always some aspect of the event. There's always a material trace in the code. And what I want to suggest is that this should be the cause for a little bit of hope on our part. This is a very famous quote from Walter Benjamin, 1930s German Marxist cultural critic, in a brilliant tiny essay called A Little History of Photography that he writes in 1934. And I've paired it with an image that, as far as I know, Benjamin never saw. But I think the image can help us understand what Benjamin is trying to do. The Benjamin quote is, "No matter how artful the photographer, no matter how carefully posed his subject, the beholder feels an irresistible urge to search such a picture for the tiny spark of contingency." So that's a key term, contingency. "Of the here and now with which reality has, so to speak, seared the subject, to find the inconspicuous spot where in the immediacy of that long-forgotten moment the future nests so eloquently that we, looking back, may rediscover it. Now, what I understand Benjamin to be saying here is that, of course, the photographer tries to control the photographic event, but there's something in the event that always means that that event will exceed the control of the photographer. And I always find this image, which is taken in the Sudan in the 1880s by a French colonial photographer called Hippolyte Arnoux, very illuminating in this context. I'm not sure how clearly you can see it, but my sense is that this is a pure demonstration of contingency. You know, this guy here seems to be just about on message. This guy here perhaps even more. So we can imagine the colonial photographer saying, he's paying these guys, we assume. He's brought them into his studio with his cork logs, and he's got all his array of you know, savage fighting instruments. He's telling them to perform savagery for French customers. And two of them appear to get the message. One of them seems pretty much off message. We're not sure what's happening here. And this guy seems to be completely skeptical of the whole endeavour. So what's happening here is you've got 5 people, you've got all this wood, you've got all these weapons, you've got a studio backdrop, you've got the complicated techniques of the camera. There's a huge number of things to coordinate and manipulate, and it doesn't all go right. So this, to my mind, is one way of understanding what Benjamin means by contingency. Photographers, image makers may have incredibly strong prejudicial agendas, but the question of whether they can produce images that reflect those agendas is often very complicated, precisely because they have to arrange this extremely complex material process in which lots of things can go wrong. So I find this very consoling image. This is, I mean, I wouldn't say it's resistance. It's about, I may use the phrase later on, it's about what Homi Bhabha calls the deformance that comes out of performance. So a lot of Homi Bhabha's work, the literary critic's work, Homi K. Bhabha, has been about this spectrum from enunciation to performance to deformance. His argument in much of his work has been that it's too simplistic to talk about colonial authority. Colonial authority implies that people think something, they want something to happen, they have the power to make it happen, therefore it happens. So that what happens is identical to what those people wanted to happen. Bhabha's work shows that there are relays here, very often material relays. You think something, but you then have to utter it. In that process, there's a slippage of translation. He's relying very much on Benjamin here. Then from utterance to performance, there's something else warping this transmission. And then from performance to deformance, as he terms it, there's another set of corruptions and destabilizations. So that if you have this model of cultural transmission, the assumption is that pretty much everything that can go wrong is going to go wrong in some way. And my experience in life has been that that's a very wise judgment. So Benjamin on contingency is very similar to the position that Roland Barthes explores in his famous 1960s or 1965 book translated as Camera Lucida. And I think he's indebted to Benjamin, but he formulates it in a rather mysterious way. He talks about the event as the body of the photograph, and he talks about what it is we want the photograph ideally to be like or to do as the corpus of the photograph. And what Barthes is very clear about is that these are two separate things. The photograph gives you the sovereign contingent record of an event, of a body. And a lot of the time, when we look at that photograph, we think, well, this is inadequate, or, you know, you're not smiling properly. There's something wrong with most photographs, because you have another kind of image in your mind, which is that of the corpus, which you continually try to mobilize the body of the photograph for. But this is another way of drawing our attention to the, we could say, recalcitrance of the photographic event. So I'd here just briefly mention someone else who should be name tagged under the picture on the right, who is the exiled Israeli photo theoretician Ariella Azoulay, now working in the US, having had a career in Israel terminated. And she has a very, some would say, idealistic political theory of photography. It's very much indebted to Benjamin's much earlier work. Part of her argument is encapsulated in the titles of one of her best works, The Civil Contract of Photography. And I think that the key elements here in her argument is that photography involves contingency, we've already seen that. It involves equality, and it involves the dethroning of sovereignty. And so she makes an argument with reference to this image, which looks like an unbelievably boring image from mid-century France. It actually shows Louis Napoleon III and his dog having taken his son to the studio of Louis Pearson in 1959. And what interests Azoulay as a kind of allegorical field is that what we don't get in the photograph is the photograph that he desires, which would simply be the photograph of the sun. She says that her argument is that the techniques, the apparatus, the sort of dispositif of the studio mean that something else happens that, in her kind of metaphorical words, dethrones the subject. So she's assuming that, you know, ideally to maintain royal power, the king should be invisible. He is the all-seeing eye who sees everyone else, but no one can see him. So what happens in this photograph is that instead of us just having this selected image of the prince on a horse, in fact we get the photographer, we get the dog, and we get the king. So photography is to be understood as this field of destabilizing the radical inclusiveness of an egalitarianism. And so on the basis of that, Azoulay builds a theory about photography that it is essentially politically likely to be politically fruitful. Now, of course, she's doing this after many decades of photographic theorists, mostly influenced by Michel Foucault, who assume that photographs of this kind are simply reflections of the powerful ideology of the state. So what Azoulay is consolidating is this idea that photographs are prone to go wrong, they're unstable. What's interesting about photographs is not that they simply show you what photographers or regimes or states want you to see, but actually because, to use a term from Roland Barthes, because of their exorbitance, they sort of show you too much, and that they provide the grounds for critique from within the image. So these are some of the ideas out of photographic theory that one could potentially use to try and interrogate the current political climate in India and the use of Photoshop images. So let's speed up a bit at this point. So yeah, so it's worth saying Adobe Photoshop bringing you Prime Ministers since 2014. Well, Photoshop's been bringing the BJP to India for a lot longer than that. So I don't know whether any of you remember the 2004 India Shining campaign, But this was very much an attempt to ratchet up a new glossy aesthetics, which, as it happened, backfired, because Congress responded with a brilliant set of very dour, noir, black and white, sombre images, and a whole set of metaphors about how India was shining on the outside but starving on the inside. So India Shining became a campaign that essentially failed in most people's evaluation. But by 2014, Modi and the BJP were getting better media advice, most of it produced by London companies. So WPP, based in Soho in London, and as we'll see shortly, Musion, the holographic specialist, also from London. So I remember these posters printed to a very high quality, being plastering Delhi in the lead up to the election. And then, of course, we have the so-called Modi holograms. These are actually technically not holograms. They're a 19th century magician's technique called Pepper's Ghost, which involves projecting a light onto a slightly slanting glass screen that creates the illusion of death. They're technically not holograms, which means they're much cheaper and easier to circulate. And that other London company, Musion, has invested in, I think, 300 travelling vans that could go to villages lacking electricity. So, you know, part of the spread of spectacle of this three-dimensional digital image of the new Hindu chauvinism clearly also involved this immense material infrastructure of these lorries slogging up village roads into taking their own power generation with them into remote locations. And if I were able to find it in the written version of this paper, I'd be able to dazzle you with the truly astonishing statistics about how many people primarily in Gujarat saw these pepper ghost illusions. I mean, it reached very significant new parts of the electorate that otherwise would not have seen the Modi image. So how can we think about this conceptually? Okay, well, so one thing I want to look at in just a moment is how the BJP government and a lot of BJP supporters, so it's quite a lot of stuff I'll show you is sometimes being described as friendly fire, in that there are hosts of BJP supporting organisations that are generating photoshopped images that don't necessarily have the approval of the central headquarters. So this is a many-tiered war of images. Three things I want to bring to your attention. I mean, the first is photography and prophecy. So this is something I've written a lot on in the past. The idea that the basic argument of a lot of my work has been that we have this idea, which in large part comes from the